You've tuned into Radio Northern Beaches. We live stream on rnb.org.au across the northern beaches of New South Wales, Australia and all over the world. You can also catch us local on 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Our podcasts are available at your convenience at rnb.org.au or rnbpodcast.com.au. So you and your friends don't miss any episodes. Don't forget to follow and share. Now here's our latest podcast.
Hello again, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches. Welcome to our program, Innovation Talk. I'm Michael Lester, or on 88.7 and 90.3 FM, Radio Northern Beaches, and we stream live on our website to www.rnb.org.au. And if you enjoy these long, in-depth conversations, please feel free to Google Michael Lester Mixcloud. That'll take you to a Mixcloud platform with an archive of hundreds of such discussions for your delight and pleasure. It seems like the startup ecosystem in Australia has been going gangbusters over the recent few years, maybe even decade or two, and they're also surging across all sorts of various sectors, which is interesting, rather than just a narrow range of maybe digital technology sectors. What makes for startup success? Startups have a very, very high rate of failure, particularly even compared to small and medium enterprises generally, which fail a lot. Something like, I think I've seen some figures, 90% of startups fail. What makes for success and what makes for failure? Are there any particular traits to do with the people who set these things up, the founders who conceive and have the vision and try and start these startups up? Pleased to welcome to Innovation Talk, Paul McCarthy. Paul is an adjunct professor both at UTS at the Data Sciences Institute and at Uni New South Wales, the School of Computing Science and Engineering. And he's also the long-time founder and CEO of the consultancy League of Scholars. In particular, we're going to discuss a paper that he and a number of his colleagues have recently published called The Impact of Founder Personality on Startup Success. Thanks very much, Paul, for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Paul, what in your background work and research and interests attracted you towards this particular topic, and for what significance?
About a decade ago, I was working for CSIRO and we're exploring some issues around graduate employment outcomes. So Australia does particularly poorly in the OECD in terms of the number of recent graduates who receive full-time employment within 12 months of graduating. And that's a really important thing, both for the individuals, obviously, but also for the whole economy, because it graduate employment outcomes affect lifetime income. And so we were doing a lot of stuff around internship, and we realized and recognized that internships are vital to getting better outcomes for graduates. But I sort of felt there was another dimension to this as well. And we started looking into this idea of personality and occupation alignment. And I was made aware of this work by a colleague at Stanford, Mikhail Kaczynski, who came to Australia, and I met him in Melbourne. He's a pioneer in computational social science, particularly in psychology and personality inference using social media. And I learned through his work and the work of other colleagues that he introduced me to, particularly Professor Peggy Kern at the University of Melbourne, that it's quite possible to accurately infer personality traits from text, particularly from social media texts. Their work has shown that you can do this with a very high degree of accuracy, higher than that of friends and co-workers, and similar to that of a spouse. So what this led us to explore was, could you look at the personality alignment of people in different types of occupations, and was there any relationship between personality and occupation? And now the literature on this previously, there's been quite a lot of literature over the last 30 or 40 years around occupation and personality, but most of the studies have been quite small. So they've looked at, for example, cohorts of 30 to 100 people, and particularly in different occupations such as nursing or sales, and does having more compassion, help you in caring, or is, being more extroverted, more valuable in, say, for example, sales roles? And the answer to most of these, as you would expect, is more or less true, but nothing really of any scale. So we started by looking at professionals in sport. We looked at tennis players, or the world's top tennis players and the world's top computer scientists in the open source movement, partly because a lot of them were active on Twitter. This was about 5 years ago now. So Twitter was sort of quite a interesting and active platform. And we found that by collecting tweets and then analyzing the personalities of the world's top tennis players and the world's top software developers in the open source world, firstly, we found that the tennis players and the software developers were very different to one another. And secondly, that they were quite similar to each other in the profession. So when I first saw these results, I couldn't believe it. I thought it was, something wrong. But turns out there's this really strong correlation between personality and occupation. And this work that we've done more recently with our colleagues at Oxford was prompted by the question, well, is being an entrepreneur just another occupation?
Right. Well, this sounds both a fascinating, potentially important topic in this day and age, with the importance of startups and entrepreneurs, particularly in the tech sector, I guess. But it must be quite a daunting challenge analytically and research-wise to, on the one hand, distinguish what you focused on here, founder personality traits and characteristics, as against a whole range of other factors that could possibly be influencing the success of startups, everything from the particular characteristics of the startup, including, for example, its industry, but many other factors, and of course the broad ecosystem that we operate in, an innovation ecosystem that impinges, for better or worse, on the success. So this is quite a challenge to isolate these personality traits. How do you basically do this isolation from the personality traits to focus on the personality traits as a driver and predictor?
Yeah, that's our colleagues at Oxford helped with that part of the study. So we got data on 21,000 startups worldwide and their founders. We chose startups where the founders were active on Twitter in a similar way to the previous study when we were looking at occupation and personality alignment. And as you said, Michael, the success of a startup is due to a lot of factors, including location. If you're based in California, you've got a greater chance of success than being based most other places. If you're in certain industries that are particularly hot, that's a good thing, and so on. And how do you isolate these ecosystem factors with respect to the personalities? So we got over 300 different features for each startup, including the personality of the founders. So we had 30 dimensions, which was the personalities of the founders. And we used a multi-factor analysis to determine the extent and strength of each factor relative to one another.
Well, I guess this multi-factor analysis must have been pretty sophisticated, and it seems that the results are very strong and impactful, aren't they? Because I think that you end up believing that the prediction of a startup success is 82.5% predictable on the basis of the founder personality. Perhaps we could take a closer look at this concept of personality. How is the concept of personality defined within your analysis? Is this a series of measures that you've drawn up yourselves, or is it drawn from broader literature? And
yeah, we're using a framework which is well established. It's the most robust and researched framework for personality in the world at the moment in the psychology space. It's called the Big Five framework, and it characterizes our personalities in 5 dimensions, which then are subdivided into 6 sub-dimensions. So you end up with 30 dimensions, and the idea is that each of these are more or less orthogonal, in other words, independent of each other, and they measure things such as a person's openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, how extroverted they are, and their level of neuroticism. What these things represent is generally a kind of the way I like to characterize it, it's kind of like an operating system, which we all have, and it's a preferred sort of way of engaging with the world. So some people prefer novelty, and others prefer routine. And it turns out that in our previous study, for example, we found that software engineers are very high on openness, which includes a preference for novelty. And conversely, professional athletes are quite willing to do the same thing repetitively and then master that. So that's kind of like the opposite. And it seems that different roles in life and different occupations have different predilections to, suitability to different types of personalities.
So, what's this database? I think you mentioned 20 odd thousand startups, I guess, and therefore, I guess, some 20,000 or more entrepreneurs or founders.
Yes.
The technique is, I believe, to take this pre-existing framework of five, as you said, personality traits, and what you're mapping these by using social media against these 20 odd thousand people, are you? How does that work?
Correct. Yeah. So what we did was we got 21,000 startups and their founders. As you said, that's like 30,000 individuals. And we selected people that were active on Twitter. Again, this research was done 3 years ago. So Twitter was a very active platform for many founders were active on Twitter, startup founders. And so we collected those companies where they were active on Twitter and their tweets, and where there was sufficient kind of publicly available language about their company and other activities. And then we used that in a large model, an inference model, which then enables you to predict features, personality features, infer personality features with a high degree of probability amongst those founders. And then you can add those features to the other features of the company, such as which industry it was in, where it was based, how old it is, and so on. And then you end up with a range of features for each company. And then we determined success. We used, from the literature, there's a scholar by the name of Bonaventura who defined, and there's many ways that you can consider success. Some might consider, a breakthrough in the technology space or the science space, if it's a kind of deep tech startup, to be success. Others may consider certain amount of fundraising, attracting money from investors. Others may consider employing a certain number of people or other. But what we took as a kind of a relatively robust or high bar, if you like, definition of success, and that is either the company has got to the point where it's acquiring other companies, or alternatively the company itself is acquired, or there's a trade sale, or thirdly it's listed on a public stock exchange. So those sort of definitions. So what we've focused on was this, then that's the Bonaventura definition of success, which is a higher bar than some. And then we looked at the companies that were successful. Were there distinctive features about those that were different to the ones that weren't successful? And it turns out there was. Personality was the most significant factor, but it wasn't just certain features of the founders. It was combinations of certain types of founders. So we found, for example, there wasn't just one type of entrepreneur, but there was actually 6 different types in terms of their personalities.
Right. Well, this is a very complex and elaborate exercise, not only in conceptualization, but also in data gathering and analysis. In terms of
Mm.
the sample that you're working with and the methodology with social media, in terms of its attributes, both positive and potentially limiting, on the one hand, your sample, was it in any sense limited to particular sorts of startups in particular sectors, for example, tech-based startups? Because of course you get startups in small business right through all sectors of the economy. So, what was your data set in terms of sectors that you were looking at? And B, using this social media data set about the personalities, to what extent might that be biased, generation and otherwise?
Yeah, these are really good questions. Yeah, we were aware, and the study points out some of the limitations of the data, and so sample bias in terms of the company space. We use Crunchbase, which is the one of about five global data sets on startups. It's the original sort of collection. It is biased towards companies that have global aspirations and aim for growth. They tend to be largely tech oriented, although not exclusively, but they're mainly tech oriented type companies. There are also companies that typically want to play in the space of accelerated external investment. In other words, they're looking to seek venture capital to accelerate their growth. So definitely there is some bias in that area. It is, however, a very global data set, and there's over 100 countries represented. It does cover most of the well-known, high-profile tech startups, over the last 20 years. But yeah, there are limitations definitely in that. Also, in terms of as you mentioned, the fact that we use language from social media means there is generational bias potentially, selection bias again. We only used data on founders that were on Twitter for a start. You might some people say, there's a variety of things people that have looked into that, the issue of how people show up on social media and whether they are authentic. But our sense and our advice from people who've worked in this area is that the people they present a self that's either authentic or the self that they'd like to be seen as being representative of them. And so that's we're satisfied with that. But the generational thing we've got another study which is looking into the question as to whether has entrepreneurship changed with generations? Are some generations, for example, current Gen Z, are they as entrepreneurial as the previous generations? And is entrepreneurship changing over time? So that's a kind of separate study that's kind of been spawned by some, consideration of some of these issues. And I think the short answer is that we couldn't find any material differences between generations on the key features of entrepreneurship that
Well,
we
that's
discovered.
interesting because your study, as I read it, is what's called a cross-sectional study, isn't it? I presume at a slice in
Yes.
time across all these people. But the longitudinal issues, as you've indicated, are potentially quite interesting. But you're saying they turn out not necessarily to be from other studies. I'm kind of interested in the analysis. Okay, you worked with this existing typology of personality traits more broadly, but did you find a clustering of the successful leaders? With particular cluster of these personality traits that distinguished them and correlated highly to success?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So we found that there were 10 features out of the 30 that were significant in their correlation with success. The most significant being adventurousness, which is a sub-facet of openness. Adventurousness is like it sounds, it's a risk appetite, but more importantly, it's an appetite for novelty. It's people that prefer waking up every day and doing something different and resist the idea of routine. And so that's perhaps not surprising in terms of startups, but I think a lot of the venture capital advice to startup entrepreneurs is to solve problems that have yet to be automated. So you know, it's a very manual process. Even though there's a lot of technology involved, often startups are charting new territory and trying things that have never been done before. Conversely, as I mentioned, you know, professional athletes, it's the opposite, where one needs to be willing to do the same thing day in, day out to the point of mastery. Startup is the opposite of that.
Guest on Innovation Talk Radio Northern Beach is Paul McCarthy. We're discussing his article with a number of his colleagues by the title of The Impact of Founder Personality on Startup Success. So there are these sorts of clusters of personality traits around the more successful startup leaders and entrepreneurs. You've clustered them, I believe, in sort of a typology, these particular features, have you? And I'm just wondering, do all of the successful startup founders display this full range of typologies and characteristics?
Yes, Michael. So what we did was we took all the 32,000 founders and we looked at their personalities in 30 dimensions, and we clustered those profiles using machine learning, and we found that there were 6 natural clusters. In other words, 6 different types of personality combinations. We gave those an acronym, which was FOLD. It stands for fighters, observers, accomplishers, leaders, experts, and designers. And the 6 different types are kind of more evidence-based and subtle versions of something that many people in the startup world have known for some time. And that is the types of people you need to start a good, certainly tech-enabled growth company is a hacker, a hustler, and a hipster. In fact, that phrase, the hacker, hustler, and hipster, was coined, I think, by an Australian startup entrepreneur in California. And we find that these 6 different types are indeed more subtle versions of those 3 simpler types. And there's 2 types of hustlers. The hustler being, you know, typically the suit or the lead, you know, the front-facing leader, often the CEO. We find there's 2 types of those. There's 3 different types of hackers, and then there's 1 type of hipster, which is often a domain expert, you know, like an industry expert.
One of your interesting findings is, isn't it, that there is, when you look at all these, that there is no one ideal personality type that you could say is the predominant driver. In fact, I think one of the particularly interesting implications and findings is that you, for a successful enterprise, from your analysis, you seem to need a diversity and team of personality styles. I think you've coined a nice phrase, ensemble theory of success, that founding a startup is a team sport.
Absolutely. That's so true, Michael. And that's probably the key finding of the whole study is that, well, firstly, just multi-founder startups are much more likely to be successful. In fact, a startup with 3 founders is more than twice as likely to be successful as a solo-founded company. But there are certain types of combinations of personality, and these are often diverse combinations. We found had 8 to 10 times more likelihood of success. So, for example, the classic hacker, hipster, hustler combination, you know, with 1 engineer type, 1 leader type, and 1 developer type, is 8 to 10 times more likely to succeed.
These findings of yours might seem to raise a lot of interesting questions and implications for innovation policies, mightn't it, towards startups? Because we do know that governments are particularly focused on trying to promote startups, including here in Australia, as I opened by saying we have quite a growth rate, and government is taking various steps to promote it. I'm wondering what this I guess you could call it, and I think it's been called a personality science approach, raises for questions of policy and practical programs. Where do you think are the implications of this for some of the ways that we try to support or otherwise new startups?
I think there's a few things. Yeah, there's a few things, and I'm just actually back from a tour. Was invited to go and visit Vinnova, which is the CSIRO of Sweden. They're undertaking a big review in Sweden of their kind of science and innovation system. Similarly, we're also working with some colleagues in Japan. Japan's looking to renovate their kind of innovation system and grow some, global startups out of a precinct based in Shibuya, a deep tech precinct they're creating. Yeah, and as you said, in Australia, we're doing similar things. But I think one of the things is to recognise that the team is really the key to success, and a lot of venture capitalists already understand this. I think some of the more mature venture capitalists in the US, there's kind of like three ways that people invest often in startups. One is people who believe in the better mousetrap theory, so they're looking for kind of like a product or very much a patentable new breakthrough technology, and they want sort of intellectual property moats around the thing, and they want to see the science and the protected IP. Other investors, and this is more like people investing in the public markets, in the stock market, have a more market-based approach, and they tend to see this rise and fall of various technologies in waves. So they might be interested in AI at the moment. Previously they might have been interested in e-commerce and so on. But the third, and perhaps I think most enlightened investor, looks at the team because I guess there's a recognition that quite often with these teams, it's a process of experimentation with product market fit, and often companies evolve not necessarily even out of the first idea that the team has, and that the team can evolve and to develop new ideas, and a good team will go on to do great things. So that's, I think, what a lot of the VCs are doing. So what does that mean for a country like Australia? I guess firstly, you need, a range of people. And we've got another follow-on study. It's a kind of an audacious idea where we're looking at personality diversity across an entire country using a different approach. And we're seeing whether or not personality diversity correlates to GDP, which it turns out it does. So that's the first thing, is to have a plurality of sort of thought and people that kind of can fit in various roles. And then more at a kind of a granular level, when you're starting new companies, you need to, I guess, particularly spin outs from universities. If you're focusing on deep tech, for example, not assuming necessarily that the scientists will be the CEO and solo founder of a company, that there may be benefits in, for example, teaming up with other people from other different disciplines and areas with different experience, different outlooks.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of implications for practical programs too, in the way that incubators operate and who they're supporting and how they're supporting them. And also, I guess, too, in the education sector, we have lots of entrepreneurship programs, but perhaps from some of the implication here, I think that you've concluded is that you can't really even teach entrepreneurialism and leadership in this sense as some sort of universal solution, can you? You've got to look to the individuals and personality and the team. So I think these are very important, I think, an insightful new perspective and way at looking at our very complex national innovation system, and particularly how startups and their success fits into that. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining us here on Innovation Talk Radio Northern Beaches. Paul McCarthy, adjunct professor at UTS and at Uni New South Wales, and founder and CEO of his consultancy League of Scholars, for joining us to talk about this fascinating topic of how founder personalities can impact on the success of startups. Thanks very much for joining us, Paul.
Thanks, Michael.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. And most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3. Now hitting the entire world on www.rmb.org.au.